Alright, now I want to go back into vampire territory, and this one was, I think, maybe suggested a while back, and really the way I look at these two is these are probably, like, if I'm just kind of in, like, the vampire mood or something, and I'm not going for, like, one of the Hammer Dracula movies, or a Bela Lugosi movie, or a Nosferatu movie, like the sort of more classically known ones, these are usually the first two that come to mind, that'll really satisfy that craving. And I don't know how much this is going to actually be in kind of the like whole versus thing, but it's more of it does feel like that one was kind of on the tail end of the era, and then it's which is something that's kind of addressed actually in Fright Night. So we'll just kind of talk about the two individually and where they're coming from in regards to when they came out and what was going on with the genre at the time a little bit. So, yeah, I figure that's how we'll handle this. But I would like to start with Salem's Lot, which is some. I had an interesting first experience with it because, of course, this Blu-ray is the whole, like, kind of miniseries, the 3 hour plus a few minutes version. And the first interaction I had with Salem's Lot was I hadn't read the book at the time yet, when I saw that cut down to about an hour 50 something movie version. And it was so sort of. I don't know what. I basically almost entirely forgot about it. The only thing I really had any memory of was the Barlow scenes, and even that was kind of vague. Um, so I eventually did read the book, and then when I saw this again in its full form, it made a lot more sense. It felt like I do feel, even though the memory's vague, I feel like there was almost like an incoherency or something. Like you could tell it was something that was really, really, really cut down. In that sort of movie version that they put out, especially since even the version that's over 3 hours after you've read the book feels very cut down. So, and they kind of really picked and chose what they kept and what they eventually cut. But there was also the case of apparently it was supposed to actually be a movie, and I want to say Romero had it at the time. But then this ended up being the same year as Werner Herzog's Nosferatu and the Dracula movie with Frank Langella. And they're like, well, we've got to do something different, so why don't we just do the miniseries thing? And somewhere in there, Tobe Hooper ended up with it. I think mainly because Texas Chainsaw had made an impact just 5 years prior. So, yeah, and then we got this story that even today, this adaptation that even today has such like this, well, I guess you could say especially today, it has like a very sort of classic feel to it. Like immediately, like I hate to say this kind of thing, especially because it's like an old person thing, but it's one of those types of horror that you watch and you're like, you can just tell that we don't really see it that much now because it captures it in such a way. But kind of the feeling of the book also. It just really captures something that just sort of exudes horror and its era. This sort of classic vampire era that's even, but like not necessarily like the like in the 50s when we had the Hammer movies, or even in the 30s, but it's almost this own world of horror that it's able to build because the whole story itself is so massive. Yet somehow feels nostalgic to the genre in general, despite being a world built strictly for this story. And I think it helps a lot that we almost immediately start with, obviously we have, Ben Mears coming to town, how the story typically starts. And then we pretty much immediately get little glimpses of Straker. And Straker in this case being played by James Mason, which is, my first thought was, that's like an amazing, like, get. It's one of those things that it seems like it'd be so ideal they couldn't actually get him to do it. But, so I was surprised, to my understanding, that James Mason was actually like really psyched to do the movie because he really wanted to play like a really sort of evil part. So it's one thing that they actually got James Mason, and it's another that he was like thrilled to do it, and so that's gonna immediately come throughout the character as we see him, and just kind of see this actor with such a massive history behind him and such a reverence just doing this role that he's just really sinking his teeth into, which is great. especially in a story like this, especially one that revolves around his characters so much. And then these little glimpses we get of just the townspeople being the townspeople and like getting the town really lived in, and we're seeing like all the gossip and stuff like that, the affairs and all that stuff. Um, but then eventually, like, they're able to get the horror to just sort of like gently sort of work its way in very slowly. But the thing is the impact is almost immediate, despite how like gradually they let it in. Because we get stuff like, you know, the backstory behind Ben when he's talking about like when he was dared to go into the Marston house and stuff like that. But the thing here is that it's the way that they don't show that at all. Like, we don't have a flashback scene. It's just like the horror of this scene is based solely on just listening to him tell the story of when he went inside the house. And then it kind of builds up to, eventually we're going to get to the point where they have to go get the coffin that presumably has Barlow in it. And the way this scene plays out, where there's a lot of build up to them getting there, and then once they get it, it's like, oh, it's like really cold. That's interesting. And then when they have it in the back of the truck, and it makes the whole truck cold, it's just like, that's basically like the way the horror works in the movie in a nutshell in this scene, is the way it just sort of gets, it slowly and slowly builds into something bigger and bigger. And then eventually when we get to the actual like in-your-face horror, we've gotten so much build up to it that it's all the more terrifying. The impact is all the more there. So even when they resort to some jump scares, they feel earned. Particularly when we get the moment like when they're when the Glicks are in the woods, and Ralphie gets taken, and it's the whole thing where he rises and they make the jump scare noise. But I think what's great about that is the way that not only is it just like the end of the scene, but it's the way he like actually seems to engulf the scene, and almost like he eats the scene with his presence. By the way he rises and just blackens the screen entirely, and that's how the scene ends. That's a really great way to do something like that, because it's a trope that kind of seems a bit tired, especially now. But the way they did that, like I said, makes it much more of a scare factor, and something that people are probably going for when they do jump scares, but it almost never actually works out that way. But obviously they had a great handle on this, and Hooper obviously especially. And of course, talking about some of the big scares, the first thing I want to note actually is what's pretty amazing about it, and this may have a lot to do with the Blu-ray transfer, is that despite being like a TV movie or a miniseries or whatever you want to call it, I love how cinematic it feels a lot of the time, and a lot of that comes from what we were talking about at the beginning, where it just kind of exudes the horror of its era, and this almost like nostalgia kind of horror, and the fact that that is throughout, and the scares don't feel like when you think, you know, TV movie or something like that, or TV miniseries or TV anything. At this particular, obviously TV's gotten much more cinematic over the recent years, but when we're talking like the 70s or even in the 90s, or in the 2000s as the other adaptation was, there was just a connotation there that was just like, it was kind of lesser on the production quality. But watching this now, especially with this Blu-ray transfer, everything just feels so cinematic, and that makes the scares feel so much bigger and more effective, I think. And there's so many, because it's like you would think with a story that has to build so much and has to focus on so many characters, and at the length that it's at, like how much of it is going to be actually the scares. And the scare factor in this movie is pretty relentless, especially once it gets to a certain point, where we have like one of the most terrifying scenes in the book to me was when Ryerson is burying Danny. And it's like the way the sun is like going down, and he's starting to kind of lose it a little more. And it's like that would have been a really hard scene to pull off on screen. And the way they do it here, while it's still not as quite as effective as the way it's described in the book, but still done very well, where we have the moments where, like, obviously he ends up down in the grave and he opens the casket. and the way, like, the eyes are open and already looking up at him, but the body's still enough that we just assume he's dead. But it's like it just lingers and lingers for seemingly an eternity on this, which really puts us in, like, Ryerson's perspective seeing this as well. And it really is terrifying. And then later, when he's at the bar and he's relaying this information, like, seeing him relay it is almost as terrifying as what we actually saw. Since this movie does very well when we go back to the Ben talking about the going into the Marston house as a kid. And yeah, obviously one of the big scare scenes, because there's a few exclusive Steelbook Blu-rays like this. There's this cover, which is the one I wanted, but another one of the covers is when one of the Glicks, I can't remember which one, but one of the Glicks, when they're at the window, because they both kind of get their turn at that. But I actually didn't want that one, not only because I prefer the Barlow cover, I think it's cooler, but that's just such a terrifying image. I don't want it laying around, because here's the thing, is when we talked about The Night of the Hunter, and we talked about the shadow scene, and him standing outside and singing, I talked about the fact that as a kid, especially, and even now, I fucking hate windows. Windows are terrifying, especially at night, and that's just the way it is. And the reason I am so fucking afraid of windows are scenes like this. Like, whether it be, like, the fog and the way they come out of it, the way they're scratching at it, their fucking faces. It is just absolutely horrifying. And we're talking about something that came out in 1979, and I feel like if I was alive in 1979, I would be describing it the exact same way I am now in 2020. It is absolutely a horrifying image and a horrifying scene, and I hate it. I hate it because of how good it is. So, and the fact that we get that, like, more than once, and it's, like, just as scary every time, really says something about that. And then we have some classic scenes, like when Marjorie comes back in the morgue, is terrifying as well, especially the way she's, like, all twisted around. And like I said, the fact that something like this, that's this old as well, like I said, was under, like, TV restrictions. Like, I think that's one of the main reasons that Romero backed out, was he thought he'd be too restricted within the TV confines. And I'm sure with I would have loved to have seen a Romero adaptation of this that kind of went a bit more past those restrictions. But, I mean, even within the TV restrictions, this is incredibly well handled and still incredibly terrifying. So I think that says a lot about the talent involved here and what Hooper was able to do. Yeah, but then obviously that brings in the one of the most terrifying aspects, which would be Barlow's presence, which does seem a bit maybe over the top if you're used to, like, book Barlow, who's much more comparable to Jerry Dandridge. But I don't know, there's something about the idea, to my understanding, the reason they made the change was that they thought Barlow should be a bit more terrifying, because, like, book Barlow is a bit more, like, you know, like, he'll lure you in with, like, comfort and then do what he needs to do. Like, lure you in with a smoothness like Jerry Dandridge has. But they wanted to, like, go all out and just make him absolutely horrifying looking. And I totally appreciate that. Like especially within the tone of the rest of the movie. I get going that route. Because the other thing also is, like, Book Barlow we meet relatively early. But, I mean, like, once, and he's, like, standing in the shadows. So, like, the scene with Dud Rogers at the dump. And he, like, talks and everything, and then he talks to the young guy that's having an affair with, that was McDougal woman, I think. There's so many characters to remember. But no matter how many adaptations you see or how many times you read the book or see anything, there's still a lot of characters. But the idea to just completely shroud him in mystery until a big sort of payoff moment, and only see, like, his, you know, cloaked figure, whatever you want to call what he has, and then the big jump scare moment when we see his face in close-up. yeah, he's one of the more identifiably terrifying looking characters in horror movie history, and the very first time we're introduced to his face is in fucking close-up in the midst of a jump scare scene. So I find that extremely effective, and I think King, they got King to back the change as well, which also helps. But that's and yeah, it does make him, like, significantly more terrifying, especially since we don't see him for as long as we do. So, like I said, I can understand both places, but we'll maybe possibly talk about that later, because you may notice that the years are attached to these two movies in the title of this video. That's because you're probably not going to be seeing the title of this video for the last time this week. So, just to put that out there. But the thing, though, is, as far as, like, it feeling chopped down from the book, because there's so much in it, and there's so many characters and all that stuff going on, I like the idea of them, like, sort of, and this seems like it might be a bad idea, depending on how attached to the book you are, but the way in which they ended up doing it, the way they combine elements, to sort of cut down with stuff that happens in the book, I thought was well done for the most part, especially the idea of having Mark and Susan go inside the house, like, towards the end, especially with it being moved to after Mark's parents have been killed, so it's more like a vengeance thing that's driving him to go to the house. I think that's a pretty effective change and a very logical one. And we've got stuff like Larry's the one that's involved in the Larry Crockett's the one that's involved in the affair now, and he gets the whole shotgun scene and all that. So yeah, it's a much more, like, prominent character already being used for that, instead of bringing in another small character whose only purpose would be this whole thing. So yeah, that kind of economy, as far as book to TV screen goes, I thought was pretty well handled. And as far as, like, the climax goes, that is a case where it's because it's the same way in the book as it is in any other adaptation. There's not really a whole lot to be done with the scene where they take out Barlow, to where it won't feel anticlimactic, because it's a very, but despite the massive nature of the story, it's so simple to take him out. You just wait till he's sleeping and you go in and you just stab him, and that's it. It's like they're so not concerned about that being, like, spoiler territory, that they just made it the inside of the case, that image of him being stabbed. Yeah, so apart from that, I still think it's handled well, like, on a cinematic nature, especially doing this thing where they have Susan kind of as, like, an afterthought, where she's kind of the final confrontation in a way, because obviously they bring the whole, like, town into it also, but much like in the story, that's almost kind of a background factor that, like, oh, by the way, the whole town is changing. So and I think that's the thing too that makes this work so well, is that there's, as far as it being, like, terrifying in regards to what's going on, is the way it's able to take this, like, when I was talking about at the beginning about how it's scary in a way that you don't really see too much, that way kind of being, like, it being such a fantastical story, but, like, the fears that it touches on feel really, like, rooted in, like, a certain sort of reality, like, whether it be fear of the dark, or fear of windows, or fear of, like, the people changing in weird ways. It's all there, and it's all still extremely, like, potent even now. What is it? 41 years later? It's kind of incredible how well it still works. But, yeah, and I'll still come back to it, and it still has just as much impact. And like I said, I can't say this enough, I just love the cinematic nature of it, despite the fact that it's, like a TV miniseries of sorts. So, yeah, and it's certainly preferred to the cut-down version. But I do wonder if I watched, since I just don't remember it at all, my whole opinion of it could be also vague. I'm a little morbidly curious to see the cut-down movie version again, just to see how much wasn't there, and how they cut it together. But because I think they may have added a little gore as well that they couldn't do under the TV restrictions. But like I said, with what they accomplished with this, I don't even know if it's necessary. So even under the restrictions, they were able to make something that's still a not completely faithful adaptation, but enough there that you can see where they made some changes that were rather skillful with what they had to work with. So, so yeah, so I still like this a lot, and it's still like such a classic. And like I said, just that image of Barlow alone, you just immediately associate with the genre itself. So that's pretty much where I stand with that, I think. And so what's interesting is that this was in 1979, which was kind of at the... We were kind of starting to go into that sort of slasher vein, and, you know, people introducing characters that just get cut up into pieces vein, where we had, like, Hooper just 5 years before had Texas Chainsaw, and then the year before this was Halloween, and then the following year would have been the first Friday the 13th. And so, obviously, that kind of started more fantastical stuff like vampires were kind of starting to get pushed to the side for this more slasher era that everybody was all about now. And that's you can probably throw in, like, That's Us on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave in that area also, even though it's not quite in, like, the usual slasher vein, it's still kind of the same, you know, cut people up and cheer that audiences were going through in a really weird way at the time. So, what's very interesting about that, and the whole phasing out of that, is it's basically the whole setup for Fright Night, that's what's going on. And what's also interesting about this is we were just talking about with Evil Dead, me and my brother talked about the trilogy a couple days ago, about how there was already kind of a self-awareness going on in 80s horror that was pretty prominent, despite the fact that the 90s usually gets credit for starting a big boom with that. And the great thing about what Fright Night does, though, is that... Because obviously, something like Salem's Lot is completely straight-faced. And because it's so serious about itself, it just amps up how terrifying it is. But the great thing that Fright Night does is it goes into... It's in a slightly meta territory, because particularly with the Peter Vincent character, basically coming out of a movie like this, only much more like low budget. But, where he's kind of in like almost like it's knockoffs of the Hammer movies. But here, the characters are aware of that, are aware that movies like that exist, are aware that people are kind of phasing out the whole vampire thing, and they'd rather see something else. But the thing is even though its characters are aware of, like, the tropes of the vampire movie, the horror in it is still played totally straight. Which is really interesting, and even to this day, kind of a unique approach, because people tend to just sort of get into the self-awareness and recognizing the tropes, and then they dive into, like, sort of making fun of it while doing it. And this, Fright Night never makes fun of it, apart from the fact of, say, you know, Peter Vincent is just, like, washed up at this point, is the closest we get to that, because people are just not interested in vampires now. But the thing is that's actually kind of a big point in the movie. That people don't care about vampires now, because it makes it so easy for Jerry and Billy to kind of do their thing, seemingly, like, right out in the open. Because it's like, you know, like, it's interesting to kind of put it in the perspective of real life, because it's like, you know, when you have to separate yourself from characters, when you say, like, characters don't know they're in a horror movie, and it's like vampires don't actually exist, so it's like, when Jerry and Billy are doing their thing seemingly out in the open, it's like, oh my god, everybody's going to know they're vampires. But it's like, no, they wouldn't, because that's not the first thing anybody would jump to. Ever. So Jerry's almost kind of reckless in a way, but to the point that he knows it doesn't matter, because, yeah, so we can even get that really great shot when he's, like, on the roof, and it's a point of view shot where he, like, jumps off of it and does the whole bat thing. And it's shots like that really stand out in a way that's, like, where you can tell they're using it to their advantage and, like, sort of taking a phased out thing like vampires and making it, like, actually cool again. But in, like, a kind of an 80s way also, to where it was kind of relevant for its era also. and it just makes the whole movie like this really great and also like clever sort of dive into the whole genre of it. But also the setup, where what's interesting about Salem's Lot is we get the whole build up. Where if you go into the story blind, there's a long time where you're not sure exactly what's happening until you know for sure that it's vampires. I love that Fright Night just jumps right into it. I said obviously these two ways of doing it work as well as they do with the way the story's told. So it's like it's not one's not lesser than the other because the other one did the other thing. So this is perfectly suited for that because it kind of turns expectations on its head almost immediately because the setup by itself is great. The idea of it basically being Rear Window with a vampire. That's the setup. Now the great thing about it is that there's no mystery to it for us. It's revealed almost immediately that yes, Jerry is a vampire. That's what's going on. The end. The rest of the movie is where do we go from there? So what's great about this is that how quickly we jump into it, like as far as them confronting each other. Because first off, we have to praise Chris Sarandon as well as we can praise anybody that's ever played a vampire. Because he's got that really like cool, suave thing going on. There's that great reveal of him when he comes down and his mom's already invited him in and he's in the chair and he like kind of reveals himself and it's like it's so interesting how well a character can reveal himself when he's a character that's already been revealed to us like 3 times up to this point, but it still feels like an almost introductory reveal because it's so well done. And how they immediately confront each other, and that very night he is in his room trying to kill him and a fight breaks out and the mother gets trapped in the room and all that, and it's like the movie is so fast in this moment in the bedroom when we even see his vampire form, and the movie's barely been on a half an hour, and it's like it feels this early in the movie it feels like we've walked in the middle of it. But what makes that so interesting is that we're kind of still in the setup. Like we're setting up the grudge that Jerry has against him and the other way around. That's going to be the basis of the whole movie. And it's like the way it sort of turns everything on its head and turns expectations on its head by getting to the point so quickly. And once you get to that and you meet those expectations, half an hour in, you have your audience in 1985 going, all right, where the hell does it go from here? And I like that it's able to do that without necessarily complicating itself. The plot is still as simple as that. Just the thing is that you bring in the Roddy McDowall character, who's kind of like I said, kind of the closest thing we get to the whole meta thing, where he comes in and he's the one that's sort of the representation of the dying era, and he's pretty much out of a job at this point because people don't believe in vampires now, or watch vampire movies. And talk about how the horror of like this new era is so like generic and brutal now, and like there were so many creative things you could do with the vampire stuff, but now it's just as simple as watching people get cut up, and that's all people are into. And it's like when you compare the two, it's kind of crazy how one was able to die out for the other to live. But like I said, obviously, much like the characters in the movie itself, this like reinvigorates the whole vampire thing. And kind of as far as like the whole stretch of time, not very long after vampires fizzled out. If you want to say like maybe Salem's Lot was towards the end, like was kind of a because we had like the Herzog movie like we talked about, and Langella's Dracula, which was kind of I think that's the thing also is we were kind of looking at we had some great ones, but also some shitty ones, but there kind of started to be more shitty ones than great ones, and then it went into something else, and then suddenly people getting cut up was like, oh, this is something new. So it's maybe not as long-lasting concept-wise, but it's new, so we'll take it. Yeah, so I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but as far as the McDowall character, what's really great that he brings into this is, like I said, it's a self-awareness without, ceasing to take the whole material seriously, because of the way that, like, because obviously he has those moments, like, I love the moment when he's assuming that Charlie's there for an autograph, and when he says he's not there for an autograph, just that sort of face he gives him, like, what? How could you possibly not want my Peter Vincent's autograph? But while because it's like, you know, if you know who I am, then surely you're a fan, because that's the only way anybody would watch my shit still. But then when it comes into him actually having to be the character he plays, and you see like that fondness, that moment I really love when Ed's talking to him about, you know, remember in Orgy of the Damned when you did this thing, and he just like starts to like reminisce, and it's like, that was one of my favorite roles. And it's like and it almost makes it this almost joyous thing that this dude that had this moment, and that's where he sort of where he was in his prime, and now that he's losing that, the fact that he's now being tasked to do it in real life is something that really makes us kind of root for him, even though he has to really, really be dragged kicking and screaming into it. Um, where he's trying to do it straight faced, which is it's so interesting how he's a character that like was known when his prime he was so over the top. When he's like doing the, you know, hosting Fright Night thing and being in the movies and all that, and now it's like now that he's in real life, he's doing the real thing. He's trying to be straight faced about it. But obviously that is not going to keep eventually. Though we do have some genuinely serious moments here that come from sort of comedic things, like the fact that it's funny that he's like, oh no, I can't do that, I can't do that. And she's like, well, we'll pay you, and he's like, all right, I'm going. It's like that's funny, but there's actually something a little kind of serious to that, where it's because this is a guy that is like, you know, getting eviction notices and is in like the worst possible moment in his life at the time. Like this is the way for him to bounce back out of this rut. But there's actually those moments, especially towards the end, when he says, you know, I'm terrified, and it's like it gets so genuine. And like I said, adding that sort of genuine fear to it, especially when we've had, you know, comedy slipping in every now and then, kind of really sets the weight in for the horror itself, and actually gives it that weight when we go into it. And gives it that impact, which is great. So, but even so, we do have other things here that are kind of bouncing around tonally, but still effectively, like in a great contrasting way. Like, for instance, Evil Ed and his whole presence here. And Stephen Jefferson's performance is one of those you either love him or you hate him things. I know some people that aren't particularly fond of the character. I love the character and I love the performance, and I think it's because there's still, without, like I said, without necessarily making fun of the genre or anything like that, they bring in like a real camp factor with the direction that Evil Ed goes. Because we do have, you know, these scenes where it's he's just like the comedy relief best friend and all that. But then we get this great scene where Jerry turns him, and they kind of take on the classic vibe, but also modernized, where he does the very classic vampire thing, where whenever they change someone, they do like the cape thing and cover them, but in this case it's just his coat. But it's like so it's a classic feel, but also modernized. And then once Evil Ed is changed, then Jeffries just gets to completely lose his mind in this performance, and I think it's glorious, especially because Chris Sarandon is so great as far as being like smooth and stoic, and like I said, a little terrifying in his presence, like not terrifying, but intimidating in his presence. And like, you know, the turned Evil Ed is like the perfect contrast to that. And it almost kind of feels like balanced, where we've got like the movie taking itself totally seriously, but it's not afraid to do camp as well. And because of the contrast, they surprisingly mesh well together, because they're so perfectly balanced. So yeah, I love Evil Ed in the movie. I don't care. So, and there's also just sort of those moments of like great timing, like when he's after Vincent realizes what's going on, when he looks at him in the mirror and he breaks it, not realizing he left a piece behind. And Jerry steps on the mirror and realizes he's been found out, just as Billy has said, oh, nobody's going to believe him now. And it's like that whole turning point, where as soon as that scene happens, that perfectly timed moment, the whole rest of the movie is just constant. and he's just a constant threat from then on. I love the moment right before they get to the club, and they're just kind of running around trying to avoid him, and he keeps like popping up the way that you do. But what I love about this and what makes it especially so eerie and really shows you how effective Sarandon's presence by itself is that nothing is said between them. Like, he's not even to each other as they're running away from him. Like, they'll just go somewhere and he's there, and then they turn to go another direction and he's there, and they just keep running. Like, it gives it like a real sense of urgency and actually makes him a scarier character with like the less that's said during these more hectic moments. So I really love the way that's done. And then of course when we actually get to the club scene, which feels another like kind of like a turning point, where the mirror scene was like a push into, okay, it's going to be nonstop from here, and now the club scene is kind of our transition into pointing us towards the climax. So we get this great scene where he tracks down Amy and does the dance with her. And I love the way this is shot, where we see it sometimes as is, and then sometimes we get those mirror shots where he's not there. And then eventually changes her, and it feels like this. It's just this really great like moment of transition, not just for the movie itself, but a lot of the characters also. And it's so well done. And then, yes, we get to the climax, and to kind of go against where I was talking about, just kind of with the nature of the story itself, where it's like it's no necessarily particular fault of the book or any of the adaptations, but the fact that the climax of Salem's Lot can easily be seen as anticlimactic. The climax of Fright Night is anything but. With Fright Night, we have a whole lot of build-up. Like I said, there's a simplicity to the story, where it starts off as like a rear window thing, and then he gets found out very quickly, much quicker than we're expecting. And he's also, with Billy, he's also kind of got his own straker as well. But then, as it goes on, we get, clever scenes like the club scene or something like that, or scenes that play more on suspense, with occasional makeup, like when the vampire forms are revealed. But when we get to the climax, it becomes a total and complete special effects extravaganza in the best way. Because usually you would think, like, when it starts to go effects heavy, it's kind of copping out. But there's been so much smooth build-up up to this point. Every great special effects moment in the last, like, 20 minutes or so of the movie is just one great payoff after another. And I think it helps a lot that it's Richard Edlund effects, who he won a couple of Oscars. He won one for the original Star Wars and for Raiders of the Lost Ark, but he did the effects for like Ghostbusters and Poltergeist and stuff like that. He's a fucking genius, obviously, and that's especially apparent in this, I think. Like I said, it just feels like one great effects set piece after the other in like a whole 20 to 25 minute span here as the movie's ending. Especially starting with Ed's death scene, in quotes, I guess, where he's been stabbed by Vincent, and he's starting at the wolf and turning back into Ed. And it's glorious, it's disgusting, but it's perfect and so well done and so gruesome and kind of scary in itself. But then that goes into the confrontation with Billy. And what's really great about that is that there's kind of a question throughout of what is Billy? Because he walks around during the day, but is he human or is he not? And then we get whatever it is he may be. I still don't know if that's confirmed what Billy is. But if he's just some undead of sorts. But when they take him out and it's a full-on like Evil Dead style, like dissolving, like decomposing and all that stuff, like all the way down to the bone. And these like it's hard to describe how insane and effective and well done these effects are, because especially being a movie from the 80s, you would think maybe they'll look dated. Sure, they maybe look dated in a way, but if any of the tiny ways they look dated really just add to the charm of them. But for the most part, they still hold up incredibly, especially the moment where you would think it would start getting silly, but still completely works, is when Jerry's like the giant bat that's attacking them. And while in another movie with lesser effects, it would just look fake and kind of stupid. Which, even if they did, the effects didn't look great, they could probably still get away with saying it's an ode to like the '50s movies where it was clear, where you got like bats on strings and shit. But the fact that they didn't cop out like that, and they did go in all in on the effects and make them look as good as possible. When Jerry is like the giant bat that's like biting at them, and they're like wrestling with him, it looks like they're actually being attacked by something, rather than like Roddy McDowall wrestling with some effect or whatever or some puppet or something. It looks like a real monster is actually attacking. I think it's in like the teeth and like how wet the teeth look make it look really authentic. But yeah, that whole thing, and then the whole climax. Like I said, where things get bigger and bigger and things start blowing up and stuff like that. There's fire, but like I said, it's such a gradual build up. It just works so well on an effects front and still looks really good. Like I said, maybe a little, 80s cheesy, but really not even that. Like I said, anything that doesn't hold up, it just adds to the charm of it. So it's pretty much perfectly done. So, like I said, also like as far as like the stakes go, no pun intended. As far as far as like when I was talking about like kind of the emotion behind the climax because of the character work, where like Peter Vincent goes into this genuinely terrified, and there's a great moment here that Roddy McDowall has when he's going up the steps and he's confronting Jerry with the cross, and Jerry grabs the cross and it just kind of crumbles in his hand, and just that look of like hopelessness that he has. But then there's also the scenes when they take out Billy and then they take out Jerry, and it's like every time, or when he kills Ed, every time Peter Vincent partakes in the death of one of these creatures, even though they're totally inhuman and monstrous and we're going to kill them, there's like a remorsefulness on his face, which is really interesting for the character. Like it almost kind of brings in that whole thing because it's actually brought up. The first time he says he's going to go kill Jerry, and Amy says, that's murder. And it almost kind of brings up a debate, like, is it? Because obviously Charlie's answer to that is they're vampires, they're already dead, technically. And so, yeah, so it's like actually seeing like the whole remorse factor of it in Peter Vincent, because obviously these are characters that were once human, and it's like, the whole vampire change is what's making them evil. So, yeah, that opens up a whole other thing just by nothing's even mentioned about that. Just watching Roddy McDowall's reactions after he kills something brings that whole thing to light. So that's pretty amazing. And I just love the idea that it feels like such a love letter to those kind of movies, like the older movies, because the movies end up being like the guide. Because obviously when they kind of try to do the meta thing in later movies, it's like, oh, it's not like what it is in the movies, or it's like, oh no, that stuff is stupid, it's actually this thing, or whatever. I know, I love the fact, and like I said, it kind of shows a reverence for the genre and the movies in general, that the movies actually do end up working as basically a guide. And it's like, oh, this is how it's everything that's worked the way it has now has been right out of the movie, so we'll just keep doing that. And I really love that. And the whole, like I was talking about at the beginning, where we get into it quickly, it's lightning paced. Like, it's insane how fast this goes. I think it's about an hour 45 or an hour 46. And it's, like I said, a stark contrast to a movie like Salem's Lot that has a whole lot to build up and a lot of characters introduced. But at the same time, Salem's Lot doesn't really feel as lengthy either. Like, especially if you're familiar with the book, and it feels especially short. Fright Night just moves so incredibly quickly. But it's, yeah, and that really brings it to life, and it has like this sort of liveliness in it because of that, where it feels like once it reaches a certain point, it's just constant the way it goes, and it just builds more and more and gets bigger and bigger in the effects department and characters and anything else. Now, this is usually where I would say, like, do I prefer one over the other? I don't know. I've seen Fright Night more times, but even despite its length, I have no trouble going back to Salem's Lot. Because, like I said, I just love the feeling that it evokes as far as, like, actual horror. So it's like, if I like really want to have like a good time with something, Fright Night's definitely the way to go. But if I kind of genuinely want to be terrified, I can still go back to Salem's Lot, which might make it a little more impressive. Um, because I feel like it might be a lot easier to, you know, give your audience a really good time the way Fright Night does, and it's in the clever way that it does. You can't just necessarily say it was easily done, and they were just saying, oh, here's, you know, some fun characters and some great effects there. No, the writing and the setups are extremely clever. Um, but I think there's an especially great talent, especially in a movie that's as old as Salem's Lot is, to be able to still be that like viscerally terrifying to me, basically. Maybe there's a lot of people that don't think that way about Salem's Lot, and I just sound like a giant pussy to them. But I will admit it. I don't care. Salem's Lot is still terrifying, even at its age. So that's pretty much probably the final verdict on this. So. Like I said, this won't be the last time I'm talking about these two stories together. There'll be one video in between, and then I'll probably do the other one. And then we'll go on. Like I said, we're kind of cramming some stuff here at the last minute, leading up to Halloween itself, and then whatever November brings is whatever November brings. So until all of that, I think that's it for this.